Hey everybody, tonight's video is called Sin and Captivity, and tonight we continue our pass-through study here in the book of Hosea, where we're going to be looking at Israel's sinful state, and we're going to see God's counsel to her. And so what we're going to find in chapter 10 is the first 8 verses is not the Lord speaking, but his prophets is speaking about him. So in Hosea chapter 10, we'll open up with verse 1 and 2. Says, Israel empties his vine. He brings forth fruit for himself, according to the multitude of his fruit. He has increased the altars, according to the bounty of his land. They have embellished his sacred pillars. Their heart is divided, now they are held guilty. He will break down their altars. He will ruin their sacred pillars. So agricultural prosperity had resulted in spiritual corruption as seen in Ezekiel 16, verse 10 through 19. And Israel has given the credit for prosperity to their idols, and they have devoted more resources to the pagan cult whenever their prosperity had increased. And the covenant required single-minded devotion to the Lord, as seen in the book of Deuteronomy 6:5. Israel's divided. Israel's divided loyalties call forth the judgment predicted in the covenant curses pronounced by Moses back in Deuteronomy 29, verse 14 through 29. And so Israel is pictured as a spouse, as an unfaithful spouse who says they love their partner while all having it be a lie, living a lie. In verse 3 and 4 says, For now, they say, we have no king, because we did not fear the Lord. And as for a king, what would he do for us? They have spoken words, swearing falsely and making a covenant. The judgment springs up like hemlock in the furrows of the field. So the last 5 kings of Israel were usurpers, impotent, and unworthy of respect. They were incapable of enforcing the laws of the land. And the king is useless without God's blessing. And while under the Lord's judgment, foreign powers dominated Israel so that they no longer had their own king. And verse 5 through 8 shows, the inhabitants of Samaria fear because of the calf of Beth-aven. For its people mourn for it, and its priests shriek for it. Because its glory has departed from it, their idols shall be carried to Assyria. As a present for King Jerob, Ephraim shall receive shame, and Israel shall be ashamed of his own counsel. As for Samaria, her king is cut off, like a twig on the water. Also the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. The thorn and thistle shall grow on their altars. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. So as mentioned here, Samaria is the capital of the northern kingdom. And calf of Beth-aven is likely a reference to the calf of Beth-aven erected by King Jeroboam. In Hosea, he mocked the pious emotions that the peoples manifest for an idol. And I want to check out verse 8 again. It says, also the high places of Avon, the sin of Israel, shall be destroyed. The thorn and thistle shall grow on their altars. They shall say to the mountains, cover us, and to the hills, fall on us. So we see that the captivity would be so severe that the people would pray for the mountains and hills to fall on them. And it's very similar to John's revelation that we'll touch on in our wrap-up. And this speaks of devastation from the Lord. And the people would rather die than face judgments further from him. In verse 9 and 10, O Israel, you have sinned from the days of Gibeah. There they stood, the battle in Gibeah against the children of iniquity did not overtake them. When it is my desire, I will chasten them. Peoples shall be gathered against them when I blind them for their two transgressions. So Israel would receive double portion of judgment for her multiplied iniquity, as seen in the book of Isaiah chapter 40 verse 2 and Jeremiah 16:18. And two transgressions may refer to the past sin at Gibeah and the present sin of Israel, to Israel's religious sin and political unfaithfulness, or simply to Israel's repeated and unyielding transgressions. And like unruly farm animals, God would control and guide Israel and Jacob even if they kicked against him. In verse 11, Ephraim is a trained heifer that loves to thresh grain. But I harnessed her fair neck. I will make Ephraim pull a plow. Judah shall plow. Jacob shall break his clods. So a trained heifer that loves to thresh grain was far easier work than plowing. And since cattle weren't bound together under a yoke, but tread on the grain singly and were free to eat some of it, as the law required that they be unmuzzled in Deuteronomy 25, verse 4. In verse 12, sow for your righteousness, reap in mercy. Break up your fallow ground, for it is time to seek the Lord, till he comes and rains righteousness on you. So sowing what is right and good brings a harvest blessing from the Lord. And so we see through the prophet Hosea here is another call to repentance from Hosea. And when virgin and fallow ground is plowed, it produces a particularly abundant harvest. And God must give the harvest. And to finish the chapter, verse 13 through 15, you have plowed the wickedness, you have reaped iniquity, you have eaten the fruit of lies. Not flies, but lies. Because you have trusted in your own way, in the multitude of your mighty men. Therefore tumult shall arise among your people, and all your fortresses shall be plundered, as Shalman plundered Beth Arbel in the day of battle, a mother dashed in pieces upon her children. Thus it shall be done to you, O Bethel, because of your great wickedness. At dawn the king of Israel shall be cut off utterly. So instead of cultivating a fruitful relationship with God, Israel has planted and reaped and eaten wickedness and dishonesty. And because of Israel's dependence on its military power and not on the Lord, as seen in Jeremiah 9:23-24, the Lord would punish them. And Shalman was probably Shalmaneser V, king of Assyria, between 727 to 722 BC, who played a role in Israel's demise in 2 Kings 17, verse 3 through 6. And although the location of Beth Arbel is uncertain, the memory of the heinous crimes committed there was vividly etched in their minds. And Beth Arbel is often identified with the site of Irbid in Gilead, though. And Bethel in verse 15 is also often called Beth Aven by Hosea. And ruin always comes when we trust in our own way instead of God's way. And that ruin was about to come upon Israel. And that is something we need to keep in mind. That ruin always comes when we trust in our own way instead of God's way. And so, to wrap up tonight's study, we look tonight at the analysis of Israel's sinful state of an empty vine. And we ought to be cautious that we don't take our liberty and blessing that God gives us and use them in ungodly ways. Let's look at Galatians 5:13 real quick. Galatians 5:13 says, "For you, brethren, have been called to liberty. Not only do not use liberty as an opportunity for the flesh, but through love serve one another." So the Apostle Paul warned about that sin to use our liberty in an ungodly way. In verse 3 through 8 of Hosea 10 showed us Israel's empty throne. And we saw captivity would be so severe that the people would pray that the mountains and hills would fall on them. Let's go to Luke chapter 23, the gospel according to Luke. Luke chapter 23, verse 30. It says, "Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.'" So Jesus quoted Hosea speaking on the last days. And then the Apostle John, Revelation chapter 6, verse 16. I just want to make a mention that my friend Brian Peckham is still doing a study focused through Revelation on Saturdays at 12 noon, subject to change. But Revelation chapter 6, verse 16, and I'm going to actually read verse 15, 16. So Revelation 6:15, "And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, and the commanders, the mighty men, every slave and every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, 'Fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb.'" So we see the Apostle John in his revelation of the sixth seal speaks of similar as Hosea. And Hosea chapter 10 verse 9 through 11 showed God gave counsel to sinful Israel to see their sin and to submit to his chastening. In verse 12 showed God telling Israel to break up the hard ground of their heart. And I want to go over into 1 Corinthians chapter 3. 1 Corinthians 3 verse 6 and 7. It says here, "I planted, Apollos watered, but God gave the increase. So then neither he who plants is anything, nor he who waters, but God who gives the increase." So God is the one who gives us the harvest, and we only plant the seed. And the chapter ends with God telling Israel the terrible result of resisting him. Let's go over to Galatians again, and we're going to look at chapter 6. I think I've covered this passage as well already, but I think it's a good reminder. All right, so Galatians chapter 6, verse 7 through 9 says, "Do not be deceived, God is not mocked, for whatever a man sows, that he will also reap. For he who sows his flesh will of the flesh reap corruption, but he who sows to the Spirit will of the Spirit reap everlasting life. And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap, if we do not lose heart." So we ought to learn from Israel's sowing and reaping, where Israel had planted, reaped, and eaten wickedness when they didn't cultivate a fruitful relationship with God. And that's going to wrap up for today's study. We'll see you again, Lord willing, tomorrow for our 14th topical Saturday of the year. And that will be announced in the morning. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Have a great, blessed weekend. And we'll see you tomorrow.